very pleased now to introduce Mich Ciurria, who is going to talk to us on capitalism, crisis, and chronic fatigue. So over to you, Mitch, and you want to enable your slides. So when you're ready, you probably will want to describe yourself first.
Okay, yes. So I'm a white person with short brown and gray hair and a black sweater. Okay. And I also wanted to note that I've posted the script to this presentation on biopolitical philosophy. So if people want to, they can follow my presentation there. Okay, so with no further ado, the subtitle for this presentation is Uncoke My Campus, or sorry, Uncoke My Philosophy Department for Disability Justice. So I'm going to talk about the influence of Koch funding on academic philosophy and how it harms disabled people. Okay, so just to give some context on my research methods, crip theory is a critical framework that challenges traditional understandings of disability and advocates for disability justice. As a crip Marxist feminist, most of my work has focused on the intersections of capitalism and ableist suppression. Other crip Marxists have noted that capitalism is, as Robert Chapman puts it, a mass disabling event. According to Marta Russell, disability is produced by the exploitative economic structure of capitalist society, one which creates and then oppresses the so-called disabled body as one of the conditions that allow the capitalist class to accumulate wealth. So in short, capitalism first disables people through productivity schedules that benefit capitalist elites. And then capitalism misrepresents disability as, to quote Shelley Tremaine, a natural human disadvantage, an inherent human flaw, a politically neutral human characteristic. That is nothing to do with capitalism's inflexible productivity schedules. So in past presentations, I've explored how capitalism imposes exhaustion and fatigue on oppressed groups through things like unmanageable work regimes, inaccessible welfare bureaucracies, and forced institutionalization. As early as the 19th century, Marx and Engels had already recognized the exhausting nature of capitalist work schedules, which they described as a miserable routine of endless drudgery and toil comparable to the labor of Sisyphus. So capitalist work is like pushing a boulder up a hill over and over until you break your back, essentially. The exhausting aspects of capitalism's endless drudgery are especially salient to me as someone with chronic fatigue syndrome, or CFS, which is a condition caused and amplified by the necessity of working for a living under conditions dictated by corporate executives, or alternatively, I can deplete my limited energy applying for Social Security checks worth less than a minimum wage. So I face a double bind between disabling work regimes and disabling government bureaucracies. Okay, so in this presentation, I want to focus on capitalism's disabling presence in academia, which J. Dolmaj identifies as one of the most disabling spaces in capitalist societies. Sorry, here it is. Sorry. So he writes, few cultural institutions do a better or more comprehensive job of promoting ableism than academia. So higher education perpetuates ableism first by adopting capitalist productivity schedules that are rigidly patterned, isolating, labor-intensive, increasingly corrupted and corruptible, but for only the highest orders of society, so non-disabled elites. And secondly, higher education misrepresents disability as a natural biological category, unrelated to academia's own Sisyphusian productivity demands. Dolmaj emphasizes that the categories of normal and abnormal, able and disabled, have been created and are maintained through higher education. So academia is basically one of the main drivers of ableist ideologies and social policies. Okay, so while the relationship between academic ableism and capitalism is too complex to address here in full, I want to focus on an area of growing concern: philosophy's increasing reliance on billionaire philanthropy, something that allows capitalist elites to influence every aspect of academia, from hiring decisions to scholarly activities to curricular development to student affairs. And it allows these billionaire donors to steer these academic activities in a right-wing ableist direction. And to simplify things even further, I'll only address philanthropy from the Koch network, which is a system of nonprofits and think tanks that pour money, often with little disclosure, into higher education in an effort to influence how Americans think and vote. Sorry, the next slide. Sorry, I was on the wrong slide, I think. Oh, here it is. Okay, so this is a quote from Jane Mayer. So Koch money basically is a way for the Koch family to pour money into higher education in an attempt to influence how Americans think and vote. The Koch network's political agenda is to promote free market capitalism while disguising that agenda as nonpartisan and impartial, often using sophistical reasoning and rhetorical sleights of hand. Okay, so insofar as free market capitalism is ableist in the ways discussed earlier, for example, the enforcement of disabling productivity regimes, the Koch network's agenda is decisively ableist. So when philosophers accept Koch money, and especially when they use that money to promote the Koch network's agenda, they are contributing to structural ableism. Okay, so I'm going to say a bit more about the Koch network. So to say a bit more about the Koch network's role in the mass disabling event that is capitalism, the Koch network is partially funded by Koch Industries, which, if you haven't heard about them, is one of the top 25 polluters in the US, contributing to deadly and disabling environmental disasters like wildfires, heat waves, drought, famine, hurricanes, and tornadoes, basically crises that disproportionately harm disabled people. Shelley Tremaine calls this disabling system of wealth accumulation disaster ableism because it exploits crises for profits in ways that harm disabled people, for example, by making them more vulnerable to homelessness and poverty. The Koch network also contributes to disaster ableism by aggressively fighting environmental protections, worker rights, paid sick leave, and other policies designed to protect people from avoidable injuries and death caused by free market capitalism. So these corporate strategies contribute to ableist oppression and disaster ableism specifically. Okay, in the book Dark Money, Jane Mayer argues that the Koch family has used the banner of philanthropy to justify the use of corporate funding to promote a right-wing agenda. Corporate philanthropy, whether it's from Pfizer or the Kochs, has many harmful effects. It biases the recipients in favor of the gift giver. It undermines trust in professional institutions. It funnels money out of well-regulated public institutions into private ones with little oversight. It allows corporate executives to burnish their reputations by presenting themselves as bleeding heart altruists who care about the public good rather than profit-driven capitalists. Over time, billionaire philanthropy undermines democracy, leading to plutocracy or rule by the rich. So as Sally Haslanger puts it, large-scale philanthropy is an exercise of power that is fundamentally undemocratic. Since charitable giving brings tax benefits, Large-scale philanthropy can undermine the people's will in favor of the donor's own values. In effect, taxpayers subsidize the freedom of the rich to realize their own vision of what is good, while simultaneously depriving democratically chosen programs of valuable public funds. So in the case of the Koch network, the vision of what is good is a free market society that allows corporations to produce disabling conditions while avoiding public accountability. Now, I want to be clear that even if billionaire philanthropy didn't have these adverse effects, I would still maintain that it's wrong insofar as it involves the exchange of ill-begotten assets or dirty money. So as we saw, Koch philanthropy partially comes from Koch industries and affiliated businesses that contribute to disaster capitalism. And Charles Koch's network of nonprofits, lawyers, lobbyists, and academics routinely fight policies that would make it easier for disabled people to make a living, take sick leave, obtain compensation for workplace injuries, and in general, enjoy the safety and security that they deserve. So disaster capitalism deprives us of security, creating fatigue and chronic illness, amongst other things. So accepting dirty money is inherently as well as instrumentally wrong. So it's wrong in and of itself and because of its consequences. So I'm going to talk a bit more about Koch interference and the Unkoch My Campus initiative, which the Unkoch My Campus is an organization that has documented many instances of Koch interference in higher education, including in philosophy departments. So I'm going to talk about a specific high-profile example. So first of all, Unkoch My Campus is a cooperative campaign dedicated to disrupting corporate power on campuses and in our communities nationwide. Unkoch My Campus tries to preserve democracy by protecting higher education from co-optation by corporate elites. The term elite capture is defined by Olufemi Taiwo as the co-optation of grassroots concepts, movements, platforms, and decision-making processes by powerful elites who exploit these resources to advance their own interests. So my claim is that Koch-funded elites are capturing philosophical resources and exploiting them to promote a corporate agenda, while disguising that agenda as unbiased and nonpartisan. So they're doing elite capture. And the Unkoch My Campus website has compiled reports on Koch interference across academia, including in some philosophy departments. So one example is Bowling Green State University, or BGSU, which received a $1.6 million grant from the Koch Foundation in 2019. And that was 3 years after they hired Brandon Warmke, who had already received a $42,000 grant for the first stage of his work on moral grandstanding, which I'm going to describe shortly. And then from 2019 to 2021, Warmke received an additional $60,000 from the Koch network, according to his CV. So when Warmke was hired, there was basically a big scandal. So BGSU professor Christian Coons complained that the hiring process was unduly influenced by Koch funding. And his colleague Molly Garner agreed and further alleged that the hiring selection involved discrimination against women, because Kevin Vallier, who has also received Koch funding directly or indirectly, had asked the committee to rank the male and female candidates separately, resulting in a female candidate being unfairly excluded from the final vote. So basically, professors were saying the hiring process was influenced by Koch funding, was unfair, and was discriminatory. Soon after Warmke's hiring, Garner left the department, and Professor Coons was suspended in 2023 for sending emails about his grievances. So after being hired to BGSU, Warmke was quickly appointed to leadership positions on key departmental committees, including committees overseeing graduate admissions, graduate job placement, and conference speaker selections. And the Chronicle of Higher Education said Suddenly, a relatively new professor had a hand in almost every part of the graduate student's experience. Okay, sorry. So, what was the impact of that change? So in 2020, 22 BGSU graduate students signed a letter to faculty members criticizing the choice of an invited speaker and asking the department to establish clear guidelines for selecting speakers in the future, hoping to curtail the Koch Foundation's influence. Some students felt that the Koch grant had created a hostile environment, and one student said that he was uncomfortable sharing left-wing opinions and described some faculty as holding a join or die cult mentality. Garner similarly worried that graduate students who didn't endorse free market principles were being denied professional opportunities on ideological grounds. So those are just some of the things that transpired after Warmke was hired to BGSU. And this is also just the version of this. I didn't have time to include all of the other details. So this is just like some of the things that happened. This is also the version of the story told by the Chronicle of Higher Education and later Daily News. But the Chronicle of Higher Education disclosed that the Charles Koch Foundation had underwritten a recent Chronicle virtual panel. And Daily News revealed that the Koch Foundation had advertised on its blog. So both of those sources had received Koch support. And that kind of shows how vast the influence of the Koch network is in higher education. So on Twitter, Professor Coons called the Chronicle article inaccurate for its glaring omissions, clarifying that the situation is so much worse than described in that article. Now, because the Kochs are known to intimidate and silence critics through aggressive litigation and financial leverage, we'll never know the whole story, but the little that we do know resonates strongly with Unkoch My Campus's reports on how the Kochs have used grants and gifts to infiltrate other departments. So this seems like part of a broader pattern. Okay, so accepting Koch money is inherently wrong because it involves the transfer of dirty money, specifically money from an organization that contributes to disaster capitalism. But this doesn't fully answer the question of whether Koch funding also influences philosophers to promote a right-wing agenda. So I think that we've seen some evidence that it does. But I wanted to investigate this question further. So in the field of medicine, a large body of evidence shows that even gifts worth less than $20 influence physicians' prescription practices. So that's why professional organizations in medicine have adopted restrictions on how much funding physicians can receive from pharmaceutical companies. But there are no equivalent restrictions on funding in philosophy. So Brandon Warmke has received over $200,000 from the Koch Foundation. Could this have influenced his philosophical practices in the same way that pharmaceutical gifts influence physicians? So to determine this, I want to look more closely at Warmke's 2 Koch-funded books co-authored with Justin Tosi. So that's what I'll do now. Warmke and Tosi's 2 books, they've co-authored 2 books. Tosi has also received funding from the Koch-funded Freedom Center and the Koch-funded Institute for Humane Studies. Their 2 books are Why It's Okay to Mind Your Own Business and Grandstanding, the Use and Abuse of Moral Talk. So starting with grandstanding. Grandstanding argues that moral discourse is corrupted by grandstanding or the use of moral talk for self-promotion. Grandstanders, in short, use moral testimony for prestige and dominance. So Tosi and Warmke would maybe argue that I'm grandstanding right now. You know, who's to say that I'm speaking in good faith? How do we know when someone is abusing moral talk? So they don't offer much guidance on this question, except to say that many people use moral talk irresponsibly, and people who hold more extreme political views, whether right or left, are more likely to grandstand for prestige than centrists. And they say in terms of dominance grandstanding, there's roughly the same amount across the political spectrum. So at first glance, this argument might seem balanced because it doesn't take a side on either the left or the right, although it does warn us against extreme opinions. But it's important to understand that the Koch network doesn't want their spokespeople to show their cards. So this is why they channel funding through dark money networks that hide their political alliances. What the Kochs want their spokespeople to do is sow distrust in public discourse, making sure no one can trust anyone's moral testimony, especially moral claims from extremists like environmental activists, critical race theorists, crip Marxists, and presumably the families who spent years in court trying to sue Koch Industries for compensation due to things like asbestos poisoning. So they want to call that moral testimony into doubt. Sorry about the slides being a bit slow. So, in an interview with The Guardian, a litigant whose father was poisoned by Coke products that contain asbestos. So Lori Knapp called the Koch family evil and right up there with the Sackler family. Now, is Knapp a good faith moral claimant or a bad faith moral grandstander? For the Kochs, it doesn't really matter. It's sufficient that we doubt her moral integrity, since this ambivalence will prevent us from taking a stand on either side of the issue. The fear of standing behind a grandstander, in other words, prevents us from taking any stand at all. So this is beneficial to the Kochs, who are just on the wrong side of history and many lawsuits. Knapp describes her late father's condition after working with Koch manufactured drywall in these terms. Every day I saw my dad deteriorate. My dad went from 138 pounds to 121 pounds. So in addition to suffering this cancer, it's almost like the victims are starving to death because they can't eat, they don't want to eat. And then he passed, and we're left here battling with a company that has far more money than needed. So the Kochs need conceptual tools like grandstanding to shield themselves from moral talk like this. Talk meant to hold them accountable and rally others around a public injustice, namely a disabling event that could have been prevented and that ought to have been promptly remediated by Koch Industries. So the specter of grandstanding fosters distrust towards moral testimony in general. Protecting the Koch network from the moral claims of victims and activists who are demanding accountability. Are the plaintiffs in the Koch asbestos lawsuit money-grubbing grandstanders? Did they speak to The Guardian for clout and fame? The Koch family wants us to not be able to answer those questions, leaving the claimant's testimony in moral limbo, unable to receive the credibility and uptake that it deserves. According to plaintiffs and their lawyers, this is the same tactic the Kochs use in court, dragging out litigation for decades, waiting for claimants to give up or die. This legal strategy is called the Texas two-step. When we cast doubt on moral testimony, we two-step around victims' moral claims, placing them in epistemic purgatory. We deny them a hearing in the court of public opinion, and we deprive them of political solidarity. So this testimonial doubt affects the victims of Koch Industries, but it doesn't affect the Kochs in the same way because they influence public opinion through dark money networks, not moral talk. So fear-mongering about grandstanding hurts the Kochs victims, but basically has no effect on the Kochs. Okay, so the second book is called Why It's Okay to Mind Your Own Business, and I think it has similar implications. It basically follows the same themes as grandstanding. So it argues that for all the messaging about solving social problems and changing the world, many of us live quiet lives and devote our energies to our families, friends, immediate communities, and even ourselves. And there's nothing wrong with that. Some people participate in activism, others take up a new hobby. Who's to say that one choice is better than the other? Okay, so far this argument might seem innocent enough, but Then Tosi and Warmke go on to say that people who refuse to mind their own business are moralizers, busybodies, and purists whose moral talk harms meaningful debate. So once again, this argument provides ammunition to Koch executives who want to protect themselves from moralizers and busybodies who don't know when to mind their own business, presumably including any litigants trying to sue them for disabling injuries. Warmke and Tosi carefully sidestep the fact that political engagement just isn't a voluntary choice for many of us, including queer disabled folks like me, whose moral testimony is always already politicized as public, intrusive, moralizing, and other people's business. So queer disabled people don't have the luxury of minding our own business because our business is culturally defined as everyone else's business. Our very existence is viewed as intrusive, offensive, and an affront to polite society by many people. So it's therefore impossible for us to mind our own business because our business, our bodies, and our moral talk are already positioned as a public spectacle, as fodder for public moral debate. So Warmke and Tosi just don't address this double standard concerning whose business is public versus whose business is private. And I'm going to go a little bit into classical liberal theory here. So in doing this, they basically resurrect the old stale false dichotomy, which was defended by classic liberals like John Rawls, between the personal and the political, the private and the public, the sphere of your own business versus everyone else's business or the town square. So this was a classical contractarian distinction, but in the 1970s, second wave feminists said that actually the personal is political. So the notion of an apolitical private sphere of the home is a myth, and this myth is used to normalize, naturalize, and depoliticize the cis heteropatriarchal nuclear family. And the nuclear family at the time subordinated women as unpaid caregivers for the most part, and by the same token, privatized caregiving by defining it as women's domestic labor. So, in the private sphere of the home, women were supposed to be angels of the house, providing inexhaustible, uncompensated care to children and disabled dependents. And who benefited from this arrangement? Mainly cisgender male able-bodied heads of household. So the myth of the public-private dichotomy, which I think is smuggled into why you should mind your own business under the banner of bipartisan philosophy, this makes it easier for the Koch empire to deny responsibility for the care of poisoned workers or to deny compensation to anyone else harmed by Koch industries. The Kochs can basically reframe healthcare as a private responsibility of family members, especially women. So, caregiving is just this private responsibility, not something that the government, much less corporations, are responsible for, which is, this ideology is to their benefit, of course. Okay, so why do Tosi and Warmke, why did they write these books? They might be arguing from the heart, who knows? But do their intentions really matter if their work is giving false legitimacy to corporate ideologies by cloaking them in philosophical rhetoric and bolstering them with quotes from dead white men like Rawls? Whatever their intentions, their work is a threat to public trust, to democracy, to the possibility of justice for the disabled and deceased victims of Koch industries, and to disability justice in general. Okay, so going back to Uncoke My Campus, in conclusion, Uncoke My Campus is a grassroots movement to protect higher education from the harms of billionaire philanthropy, including the use of dark money to fund ableist right-wing agendas, to gaslight the public with sophistical reasoning, and to undermine democracy. Philosophers should apply the principles of the Uncoke My Campus campaign to their own departments. Uncoke, my campus has a number of active campaigns at universities across the United States, and I urge my colleagues in the US to join one of these campaigns, start your own campaign, or do whatever else it takes to protect your department from Coke influence, if not for your own sake, then for the sake of disability justice. Thank you.
So thanks so much, Mich. We don't yet have any questions in the Q&A, but I'm sure they will come. That's my fault for not reminding people to be putting their questions in when you're speaking. Very, very interesting presentation. Bowling Green State University is a fairly notorious, or at least the philosophy department has been a notorious area for a long time. So even in this country, in the UK, we know that if something comes out of the philosophy department of Bowling Green State University, you don't treat it like things that have come out of other departments. And I think I've known that for 20 years, maybe, because there was a journal, Social Philosophy and Policy, came out that was based on an annual conference. And the very first numbers of that, it was highly prestigious to publish in it. But at the same time, you knew you were giving cover for a few crank libertarians who wouldn't have normally got their papers published in journals of that quality. So it was a long time before I was invited to one of those conferences. By the time I was invited, the journal had lost a lot of its prestige. But I still went along partly out of curiosity, and it's also hard to turn down money when it's offered to you. But I definitely got the feeling there was a mix of people of good philosophers, some good philosophers, some people who seem to be doing good work who happen to be libertarians. And it's not impossible to be a non-corrupt libertarian. There were also people who seemed to be following the money, but rather small numbers, and they weren't very highly regarded. So I just wonder, so I've got two questions, I suppose. One is Bowling Green State University a special case? And was it already somehow, don't want to say corrupt, but was it already inclined in a direction that made it easier for Koch Foundation to take it to the next step in a way which might not have been so easy for other universities?
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer the second question because I'm not too familiar with the history of BGSU. So I just started looking into it after it received that Coke money.
Okay.
Yeah, but maybe it was more right wing, and that's what made it amenable to taking
Mhm.
taking money. Um, but in terms of whether BGSU is an exceptional case, I think it's exceptional in that it's been so deeply infiltrated by Koch funding, and basically that Koch funding created a rift in the department, resulted in some professors leaving or being suspended, and significantly influenced the practices of the department. So I think it is in that way exceptional. But having said that, I think that there are other philosophers who have certainly also received Koch funding, whether through the Koch Foundation or through other Koch-funded nonprofits. And so this isn't that unusual in philosophy, and I think that it's increasing in prevalence because as society becomes more corporatized and privatized, there's less and less money going into higher education. So philosophers are becoming more dependent on billionaire philanthropy. And does it affect their work? That's what I'm trying to determine. So I think that in the case of Warm Tosi, based by my lights, it influenced their work. Actually, I can read this quote from Charles Koch, which I think is really interesting. So he said about funding higher education, if we're going to give a lot of money, we'll make darn sure they spend it in a way that goes along with our intent. And if they make a wrong turn and start doing things we don't agree with, we withdraw funding. So they've been pretty transparent about what they expect from people who accept their funding. So they're especially egregious in terms of kind of like planting corporate shills in academia, or demanding that they kind of or expecting that they conform to this corporate agenda, at least based on some of the things that Charles Koch has said. But yeah, I think more and more people are accepting billionaire philanthropy, which I think is really problematic because it often comes from unethical and ableist sources and often contributes to unethical ableist practices.
Okay.
And yeah.
Yeah, we've got a lot of comments. Some are coming in the Q&A as directed. Some comments have come in through the chat, so I'll try and pick those up as well. But if I can encourage people to use the Q&A rather than chat, it just keeps me clearer in what I'm doing. But I just will follow up. There's a comment in the chat from Will Luger, who says, I was a grad student at BGSU philosophy for 8 years. The BGSU philosophy department had become very small and apparently considered closing down prior to obtaining the Koch money. So it's just an interesting point about, I suppose, about its vulnerability and given its history, whether that was right. So thank you, Will, for that comment. I also, as you were talking, I didn't know this work, and I didn't know the philosophers involved. So I did a quick Google Scholar check on them, and they published a paper in Philosophy and Public Affairs together on grandstanding, which has been quite widely cited. So that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because it's not just a book by an amenable publisher. They've managed to get their paper into probably the best journal in the field that's widely spread, widely read and widely cited. But they're not massively cited figures. They're on the lower citation end apart from that one successful publication. So yeah, it's an interesting bit of sociology here to look at as well.
Yeah, I think they're cited more than me. But regardless of their professional impact, I don't agree with what they're doing.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's go to the Q&A. So Melinda Hall begins. I'd like to hear more about how to push back against dark money style granting agencies at universities and colleges. So what will that actually mean in
Yeah.
practice?
I suggested joining the Uncoke My Campus organization. So they have a bunch of initiatives at different campuses. So I guess you can sort of raise awareness about the influence of Koch funding in academia. And I guess just educate yourself and spread the word if you're brave enough to take on the Koch Foundation. Um, yeah, and maybe also just like professional regulations around billionaire philanthropy. So one of the reasons I was interested in this question is that my dad's a physician, and I remember that in the 80s, we would go on cruises sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. We would go to ski resorts sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. So we were living this lavish lifestyle at the expense of big pharma. And in the 90s, that gravy train dried up because professional medical organizations like the American Medical Association and the Canadian Medical Association placed restrictions on basically what pharmaceutical companies can do with funding. So they did a lot of research and they generated an overwhelming abundance of evidence showing that pharmaceutical funding significantly influences physicians' prescription practices and biases them in favor of prescription drugs that are associated with pharmaceutical brands but are not necessarily in the best interest of the patient. So it was harming the public in this very direct way. So they basically placed these restrictions around pharmaceutical funding so that doctors could no longer go on these like cruises and other like vacations sponsored by big pharma. So, and they also introduced policies around disclosure, and these have not been fully effective. So there still is a lot of pharmaceutical influence in medicine, which creates conflicts of interest. But I think that we could at least start by introducing regulations on how this money can be used, whether, requiring people to disclose their funding, because it's hard to trace this funding. So some people have it on their CV, but I've found that most people just don't disclose anywhere that they've received funding. So you have to do this deep Google search to even find who's affiliated with the Koch Foundation, and a lot of the money is sort of like funneled and laundered through nonprofits that don't that people wouldn't necessarily know are associated with the Kochs. So they do this whole money laundering thing. So it makes it hard to trace philosophers' funding sources. It makes it very difficult. You have to do like investigative journalism to sometimes find out who's receiving Koch money. So this should be open, publicly accessible information. So I think that we need professional standards around billionaire philanthropy because I think based on the evidence, it is significantly influencing the direction of philosophy in a right wing, in my opinion, ableist direction.
Okay. I mean, as you were talking about your father and the cruises, uh, it came to mind. I was asked to give a talk in a university in Tennessee in the public health department, and they asked me to fill out a form on conflict of interest. And so I was looking at this thing, and it said you don't need to declare if if you're employed by a pharmaceutical company, a hospital, a commercial blood bank, and about a dozen medical things. So I wrote back and said, surely there's a mistake on this form. Surely those are the ones I should declare. And they said, no, the
Mm,
form is accurate. So I had to declare that I was a member of the Nuffield Council of Bioethics as a potential conflict of interest, but I didn't have to declare that I'd done a consultancy with a pharmaceutical company because obviously there'd been some sort of background thing going on about what we can't say they pretend to have a conflict of interest policy. But it was
yeah.
actually the opposite. So, and this was maybe 10 years ago rather than 30 years ago. So,
Yeah.
it was still a battle to fight there.
It is.
Um,
Yeah, medicine is still not nearly transparent enough, but I don't know, like philosophy needs some standards to start with, and then we need to make sure that they're fair and transparent.
Fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a question from Cecilia. In fact, two questions, but I'll take the first one first of all. So it's quite long. Thanks, Mitch, for your informative talk about the problems with corporate funding influencing higher education, including influencing philosophers' publications, as exemplified by Tozy and Warmke's publications. I'm on board with everything you argued, but I also want to add an additional perspective on your criticism of Tosi and Warmke's motivation to write Why It's Okay to Mind Your Own Business, which I think would be important to explicitly address. Specifically, such position works to break up the solidarity of members of different groups in supporting other group members and also allowing complacency. In other words, I think the Tosi and Warmke suggestion that it's okay to mind your own business is not intended to speak to us, those who can't do so, but to those who can, but should not for the sake of justice. So I don't know if you have much
Yeah.
to comment on
I
that.
agree. I agree. I think that their work, whether it's intentionally or not, it discourages people from showing solidarity with oppressed people because it's basically saying we can't trust oppressed people's moral talk because we can't trust moral talk in general. And who's generating, oppressed people are generating a ton of moral discourse, which is, presumptively untrustworthy because of the risk of grandstanding. And then, also those people who are generating moral talk are not minding their own business, and so you shouldn't show them your solidarity because they're busybodies and moralizers, and so they're just harming, they're like polluting the marketplace of ideas with their garbage moral talk. So yeah, so I think that the effect of these discourses is to suppress political solidarity. I think it's two things: to shut people up so that they don't point fingers at people like the Koch family, and to suppress solidarity so that no one is supporting moralizers.
Good. Thank you. So I'm going to take Carl Aho's question from the chat rather than the Q&A. Um, so how do you think Warmke's role in philosophy today has changed now that he's at the conservative funded center at the University of Florida? So I don't know, were you aware that he's moved? So I don't know anything about him, so I can't fill in the background here, but do you know about this?
I'm not sure. He recently published that. I'm sure his His research. So I think I'm not sure. I'm gonna have to look into this. Actually, that's a
Mm,
good question. I should investigate this.
okay.
But I think that as long as he's just personally receiving Koch funding, his research is going to be going in the same direction. So like criticizing moral talk more or less. So that's the impact that he's going to have on philosophical discourse. What I'm not sure how he's um affected
Okay.
Florida State. Yeah.
So we've just got a note in from Sarah Ghaffari. Dr. Warmke is still here at BGSU and is moving next year to the Center for Western Civilization at Florida. Okay,
Oh,
so this is news ahead of time. Okay, so something will change.
so
At the Center for Western Civilization, um,
interesting
that
title.
it sounds either very old or very new, a title like that, because you would
Okay.
think that
Yeah.
most would have changed it. Yeah.
Sorry. The Koch Foundation likes certain buzzwords, so they try to avoid controversial perspectives and controversial concepts. So they'll use words like classical liberalism instead of libertarianism, and then they'll cite people like John Rawls, who have been very influential in philosophy, as opposed to Nozick or libertarians. So they present their view as classic liberalism because that's seen as more centrist, even though
Mhm.
I think that I mean, feminists and critical disability theorists have argued that it's right wing. Charles Mills argued that it's right wing. So they're presenting it as some kind of like centrist, nonpartisan philosophy. And they'll use the term Western civilization. So there are certain
Yeah.
buzzwords that billionaire philanthropists tend to like.
Mm. So, and Sarah's followed up with another note, which sounds like you may have your wish may have come true here, that the BGSU department is at present voting to close the PhD program and philosophy major, which I mean, it's very sad to see anything close, but it may be that it needs to shut for a little while before it can start up afresh, maybe. So I don't know
Oh.
if you were aware of that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think a question some people might ask is like, oh, if we don't accept billionaire philanthropy, then philosophy departments are going to close because they depend on that funding for survival because higher education has become extremely privatized. An objection that someone might present, but I just don't think it's worth it. I think Harvard had received funding from Jeffrey Epstein. I
Hmm.
just don't believe in doing deals with the devil. Don't take these people's dirty money. I think it can cause nothing but harm and it's just inherently wrong. So I think that when you're talking about people like Epstein or Charles Koch even, it's just not a good deal.
Hmm. So we're doing this under the banner of the Blavatnik School of Government. And Blavatnik, of course, is Len Blavatnik, the funder. And and Oxford University has attracted a lot of money from very wealthy people. And you know, it's done this all through its history, not just now, but it's been part of what it's done. But we seem to have a different approach to some of the American approaches where we don't let the funder do anything other than give us money and set the original aims, but then have no role in management after that, which can be frustrating for some funders, of course, because what they want is a further influence. But we say, no, we celebrate your gift by naming things. Now, of course, many people will think we're being very naive here about the extent of power, but there isn't a mechanism for withdrawing funding, um,
Hmm. Yeah.
which
Yeah.
makes quite a big difference.
Yeah, I don't know if I would. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that the Koch Foundation could withdraw funding from BGSU once it had given it to them, but they could stop providing more funding and try to penalize them in other ways. But I also think that these billionaire philanthropists strategically invest in programs and people who will be loyal to them. So they could make a mistake, but they tend to target and financially support people who they expect will be loyal to them. So they'll basically act as their spokespeople. So I think that's kind of how they perpetuate their message by choosing the right people and programs.
Right. So this is really the point that Melinda has made in the Q&A. So Melinda Hall says, it bothers me to know how easy it is for outside agencies to direct programming if desired, or if there's at least one complicit person. Now, Grant's office is not set up to evaluate or interrupt inappropriate overtures. So I guess that's the same point, unless you want to elaborate further, or okay.
Oh yeah, yeah, I'm good. But yeah, thanks for reinforcing that. I think that yeah, I one well, it's like one bad apple spoils the bunch. Like one well-funded person can cause a lot of trouble in a department, apparently. Yeah.
So it's yeah. Okay. So Shelley would like to come in. Like to come in on the microphone and camera, Shelley.
I'll just put my glasses on so that I can see. So Mitch, I have two questions, I guess, that I'd like to ask. Well, first, I was wondering if you had done any investigation into the Templeton Foundation and the way that they influence what philosophy gets done. So that's one. And two, I guess was hoping that you could maybe make even more explicit the connection that you're drawing between the Koch funding and ableism.
Yeah, okay. So I'll start with the second question. So I think that one department, so if you look at BGSU as a case study, they received funding, then there were allegations that the professors were essentially imposing right-wing ideology on students and using this as a how do I put this? So they were basically using right-wing ideology to select speakers for conferences, to choose which students to mentor and which students to promote. So it basically affected most of the activities within the department. So I think that the Koch funding can influence departments to promote right-wing ideologies that are harmful to disabled people, because these right-wing ideologies are aligned with disaster capitalism. So it prompts them to argue that it supports these right-wing claims like you should mind your own business, you should avoid grandstanding, things that are implicitly or explicitly harmful to disabled people. So I think that because the Koch agenda is aligned with disaster ableism, Koch funding promotes disaster ableism through philosophy. Hopefully that makes sense. So that's the basic idea. And so billionaire philanthropy also it is given to people who are already quite right-wing or libertarian. So that funding is not promoting people who work on Marxist feminism or critical disability theory in general, because that's not the kind of discourse that the Koch family wants to promote. So it's basically marginalizing these so-called extreme perspectives like Marxism and critical disability theory, and it's promoting the voices of people who support right-wing ideologies. Yeah, and then so moving on to the second question, in terms of the Templeton Foundation, I think it's quite right-wing. I want to look into it more. I know that Jason Brennan recently received over $1 million from the Templeton Foundation, and he is libertarian. He's contributed to the Bleeding Heart Libertarian blog. And I think he's worked with other right-wing organizations. So I think the Templeton Foundation is also problematic. I think billionaire philanthropy in general is problematic because it gives too much power to the rich, and the rich have a certain political agenda that they're interested in funding. But I think that certain billionaire philanthropists are more problematic than others. So I think the Koch Foundation and probably the Templeton organization are pretty problematic, and I want to look more into Templeton. Yes.
Yeah, thanks very much for answering those questions. And I just want to suggest that it might be a long shot, but you might consider uh, emailing Jason Stanley and asking him if he would talk to you about the Templeton Foundation, because I remember several years ago there was quite a bit of controversy and heated discussion in the profession about funding that was coming from the Templeton Foundation, and he was, I believe, at the center of those discussions, so that you might consider contacting him.
Yeah, good idea. Thank you for the tip. I'll do that.
So, so thinking about the foundations that have been associated with more right-wing thought, I just tried to Google it. It didn't come up properly, but the Liberty Foundation. Do you recall the Liberty Foundation? They would produce very cheap, high-quality books. So, many of us who've got Hume's essays, I think it was the Liberty Found. I think it was called the Liberty Foundation. But I just Googled it and some sort of aeroplane society came up, so I must have the wrong name. But they would, it was a right-wing funded organization that put out probably hundreds of different books, and they would pay academics to go along to seminars to see whether an old book should be reprinted. So probably with mass reprints and other forms of reprints, this is an obsolete model now. But for a long time, that was considered, the place where right-wing thought gathered in political philosophy, but without really doing much beyond that. It was just a place where there was a type of attempt to restore a right-wing view, which sort of prompts me to think, because every now and again I have these conversations with students about why is academia and particularly political philosophy so left-wing, and why do we have so few right-wing authors that we put on the reading list? So we put Nozick on. If I put Roger Scruton on, people criticize. We put Carl Schmitt on, people refuse to read it. So you want to, well, let's have a protest about having a Nazi on the reading list, even though it was one Nazi among 50 readings. And so if I was defending, which I'm not, but if I was defending some of this, I would say isn't about restoring balance. You're worried about any right-wing infiltration at all, but you're talking about something that's already 99% left-wing, and you're worrying about the 1% or less of right-wing thought that's coming in.
That's a matter of perspective. So I would say that academia is very right-wing. Actually, it doesn't seem very left-wing to me at all. So I guess I'm more left than most people.
Mhm.
And so when I cited Jay Dolmage, he
Mm.
basically said something that might shock some people who think that higher education is very left-wing. He basically says that higher education is the main driver in our society of ableist ideologies and social policies. So
Right.
if, academia, higher education is structurally ableist, so when you look at syllabi, you're going to find a lot of ableist content on there, or just an absence of disability, just a complete absence of disability theory, but more likely ableist ideas. So I guess I feel that academia is structurally ableist, meaning right-wing in at least that respect, but probably right-wing in a lot of other respects. And it's
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, I'll let you.
Okay, so look, so I think this really goes back to Shelley's point, which is so I didn't know the J. Dolmas work, but it was very, as you presented it, very depressing and very plausible, and also I should say available. What's the book? Active Ableist Academia is available for free on Kindle at the moment, so that can be downloaded for nothing, which I've just done. So I'm looking forward to reading that. But when people talk about academia being left wing, they don't mean uh, disability inclusive. They're talking more about the welfare state and redistribution. So by this, now from your perspective, John Rawls might be right wing, and there's certainly right wing aspects, but no society has come anywhere close to implementing the difference principle. So the difference principle is a more radical principle of redistribution than we've ever seen, even in the Scandinavian societies. So from that point of view, in most academics who are Rawlsians, even though they're criticized as being right wing and establishment, they're actually promoting an economic view which is further left than anything we've ever seen in any country other than the communist countries. And most academics in political philosophy are in that area, roughly. So that's what I mean by the criticism, by the point that it looks to many people like political philosophy is left wing, not right wing.
Yeah, it looks to people like that. So I'll just say one qualification. No capitalist society has come close to realizing the difference principle. Maybe some pre-capitalist societies, like more traditional cultures or indigenous tribes, have come close to realizing the
Okay.
difference principle. But under capitalism, yes, like part of my argument is that capitalism is a fundamentally unequal and ableist social arrangement, and that has affected every social institution, including higher education. So I think that a lot of so-called liberal critiques are working within capitalist structures to try to promote piecemeal reform. And Robert Chapman writes about this in their book at length. So I think that these like piecemeal proposals about how to change the system from within are, by my lights, not actually that left wing because they're not very revolutionary.
Okay, but fair enough, and I absolutely understand this. But from the point of view of looking at the curriculum,
Mhm.
who are the authors that we get students to read that defend capitalism? And there are not many. So we might put Jason Brennan on the reading list, uh, um, although he doesn't write to everyone's taste. There might be a bit of Hayek or Friedman, but these are like novelty acts against a
Yeah.
background of criticism of capitalism.
Yeah. Okay. So I still
Mhm.
don't think academia is left wing, but having
Right.
said that, there are these like really bad apples, like Jason Brennan, who wrote a book called Against Democracy, which argues that society should be run by epistocrats, or basically like the most knowledgeable, basically non-disabled, cognitively non-disabled people. So I think this is an essentially ableist proposal. But yeah, we
Right.
have these like really bad apples like Jason Brennan and, in my opinion, Warm Cantosi. Um, and I guess that, I mean, I guess that's why I'm targeting these really extreme cases of, in my opinion, ableist propaganda. But I would say that even more moderate positions are perhaps implicitly ableist in many cases.
No, I completely agree with that. I'm not trying to argue against that. I was just trying to do the sort of devil's advocate of someone who's saying we have a very unbalanced curriculum, and so all these people are trying to do is balance the curriculum. But let's leave that now because I think we've
Yeah,
exhausted
sorry.
it. I know so Will Luger asks if there are better funding models that could alleviate the dilemma between closing doors versus accepting bad people's money. So what else could we do?
Yeah.
Um, so he says there was purportedly a lot of effort to prevent the Koch arrangement from leading to pull strings at BGSU. A lot of people don't find this convincing. So it looks like they have had that dilemma. They take the money or they close down. But
Yeah.
is there a third option?
Yeah, basically public funding. I'm really against privatization. In Disaster Capitalism, Naomi Klein writes about the problems inherent to privatization, and specifically discusses examples of corporations privatizing school systems or school districts, and how that results in lower quality of education and often a kind of right-wing curriculum, because
Okay.
private corporations have more control over education, so they try to turn it into a right-wing propaganda mill. So I think that public funding is the answer. And how do we get public funding? Just continuing to protest and participate in
Mhm.
activism as much as possible. Because unfortunately, neoliberalism is just gaining momentum and, contributing to what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism.
So that takes us on very nicely to HSA's question, which is, can you please elaborate about, well, ableism disaster? I think you use the phrase disaster ableism.
Mm.
So can you say a bit more about that? please?
Yeah, so that's Shelley Tremaine's term. I'm pretty sure she coined that term in another presentation. And I think it's influenced by the concept of disaster capitalism, but at least the way I'm using it, I'll just say the way I'm using it, is to describe a system of disaster capitalism, which allows corporate elites to exploit crises for profit in ways that disproportionately harm disabled people. So Tremaine gives the example of the expansion of MAID during the pandemic, but I think also, I mean, there's so many more examples. So um, just so corporations privatizing the education system, that's actually a key instance of disaster capitalism in Naomi Klein's work, or corporations passing policies that deregulate environmental protections, making people more susceptible to disabling environmental disasters. Or privatizing the education so that it doesn't have it's not as accessible because it doesn't respect accessibility requirements as much as public institutions. So yeah, so disaster ableism is basically this like co-optation of various social institutions by private corporations that are invested in an ableist, cost-effective, efficient society.
Okay. So there's a question from Aaron Hemion,
You
and
know,
I didn't follow the question in the Q&A, but it's been
excuse me, Jonathan.
sorry.
Do you mind if I just add a bit to Mitch's
Sure. Yeah,
description
yeah,
there?
yeah. Go
Okay,
ahead.
I just wanted to by disaster ableism, I also wanted to emphasize that neoliberalism, capitalism, utilizes the disasters such as the pandemic to introduce and to bring into full realization neoliberal policies so that will my example was how the government of Canada and has brought into effect policies with respect to MAID that have exploited how the disaster of the pandemic how it has have it the pandemic has been its harmful effects on disabled people have been exacerbated by neoliberal influences. So it's neoliberal influence is exploiting a disaster for their own benefit. Basically, that's all I wanted to add. Sorry for interrupting, Jonathan.
No, absolutely fine. Thank you for doing that. Aaron, I saw, Aaron, you'd reframed your question in the chat. I was about to say, but thank you. You've also done that in the Q&A. And I think it's a question that goes really to the first part of your presentation, Mitch, where you're talking about academia as ableist rather than the money coming in. And the question is, many philosophy papers appeal to intuitions, including metaphysic papers, to ground a universal sense. Jürgen Habermas in The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere gave a history of the construction of common sense. Is it possible that the essay style that speaks in an unvocal or univocal key actually reasserts neurotypicality?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, Robin Dembroff has a paper on philosophical common sense, or like the common sense intuitions that prevail in academic philosophy. And Dembroff says that those are predominantly the common sense intuitions of the culturally powerful, whereas the common sense of marginalized groups like disabled people, racialized people, queer people, that common sense is actually seen as nonsense, non-intuitive, outside of the space of reasons, lacking epistemic credibility, not real philosophy, just activism. So yeah, so Robin Dembroff talks about academic common sense and how it's been constructed by privileged people. And that common sense kind of overshadows and marginalizes the lived experiences and intuitions of oppressed people. So yeah, I think that when philosophers appeal uncritically to common sense, sometimes they're just invoking entrenched academic biases. So
So
it
I
is,
think, yeah.
sorry.
So that I think it was half the question, but I think the real question wasn't so much about common sense. I think common sense was used as an example, but I think the real focus was worrying about the production of an essay and the way and the types of expectations we have, probably both in students and in ourselves, of what type of output we produce. So what counts as philosophy, or
Yeah.
what counts as a style of presenting philosophy? Is that something that reasserts neurotypicality?
Yeah. So what counts as an essay? Um, yeah, so the method used to the methods used to produce an essay, is that what it's about? As opposed to like the content, the method.
Well, it could be either. I mean, if you've got
Yeah.
a way of thinking about either of them.
Yeah, so I think that definitely the methods and intuitions in philosophy reinforce neuronormativity because they come from the neuronormative majority. So I do think that there is a neuronormative bias in academic philosophy. And one reason I say that is that there's this very standard way of producing an essay. So you like follow this pretty rigid formula. And I think that in and of itself is kind of contrary to neurodivergence because the neurodivergence movement says that there are many different ways of thinking and expressing your thoughts. So just the fact that like the philosophy essay is so rigid is against neurodivergence, in my opinion.
Just a quick comment on that before I go on to Cecilia's. It's often noted that some of the very most successful philosophers, and by no means neurotypical, so Saul Kripke or David Lewis, for example, would be examples of people who are not neurotypical, but also role models for many other philosophers. So I think it's a very complex area here. But let me ask Cecilia's second question, which, sorry, Cecilia, I saw it and I skipped over it before. I was also wondering if you might have any thoughts about the very significant focus on AI in higher education, and especially philosophy, and the potential of corporate influences on the research being done here. I think AI research, especially research on AI ethics, is very important, but it seems like there could be some problems with corporate funding influences, including how quickly higher education institutions adopted the use of AI across the board, which is causing a lot of pedagogical difficulties. But I think this point that so much AI ethics research is being funded by very wealthy corporations,
Yeah.
I think that is a red flag, is it not?
Yeah, I think AI is biased. I've written about this a little bit. So AI also has a neuronormative bias because if you ask it a question, it basically generates this neurotypical answer based on content that it's scraped from places like Wikipedia and Reddit, websites that are disproportionately white male and neurotypical. If you think of like Wikipedia entries, just white men disproportionately contribute to Wikipedia. So it's like scraping the internet, focusing on these sites that already have this entrenched bias. And then it's generating these very standardized responses that tend to replicate the mainstream cultural common sense, like these very common sense answers, which are not very consistent with revolutionary crip theory or Marxist feminism, in my view. Like it's not systematically generating Marxist feminist responses. You can prompt it to do that, but the default response is going to be very like culturally centrist. So I think that AI does have this entrenched bias, and the people who fund AI basically just want it to produce marketable answers, marketable content. And so marketable content is kind of bland, somewhat inoffensive, centrist, arguments.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's biased.
It's certainly very polite when you say that, inoffensive. That a friend says they can always tell when an email is generated by ChatGPT because it's
Yeah,
too
polite.
nice and polite. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
very nice and
so
polite.
we've got a very interesting observation from Christian Rodier. Republic funding. I'm in Alberta, Canada, where public funding is primarily from tax revenue on the oil and gas industry. So when I take these points about philanthropists who bolster a political view, our public funding comes with considerable upstream strings. Is it possible to foster subversive work downstream within philanthropist funding? Academics can produce research quite a bit different from what they propose on the grant applications. Thank you for this discussion.
Yeah, public funding also comes from unethical sources. It's true. So there's a bit of there's a double bind there. Like, do you take money from the Alberta government or the Koch Foundation, both of which have their hands in oil refineries? But I still think that accepting public funding is definitely better. One reason being that at least in um, at least in democratic countries or countries with, I don't know, electoral democracies, let's say, um, you have the option of voting people out of political office, whereas corporations are authoritarian. So you have no control over over Charles Koch, and his empire is just going to go to his children or people that he has specifically selected. So it's more of a monarchy as opposed to a democracy. At least when you're getting public funding, you have some say over um, over politics. You have some say over who's in political office, whether through voting or through demonstrations, protests. So there is some small level of accountability. Whereas with the Koch Foundation, with people like Charles Koch and Elon Musk, there's no accountability at all. So that's why I favor public funding over private. There's somewhat more accountability there.
But there's also this interesting point that when you're getting government money, there may be, in some sense, less accountability at your end. That is, if you don't do exactly what you said on the grant application, then people may say, well, it has merit anyway, we would have funded this. Whereas if it's from a right-wing group and and you don't do what they want, then they're going to be much less happy because it's almost commissioned work. So I think it's a very interesting observation about sort of the degrees of freedom that come with different types of funding. So I think there's one request really addressed to Shelley from HSA to ask, where can you give a reference, please, maybe in the chat, for where you discuss disaster ableism? If you could put that in the chat, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I have done so. I have done so. Thanks, Jonathan.
Okay, great.
And I also cite Tremaine's presentation in my presentation, which I've posted on biopolitical philosophy, and I've cited all of my sources there. So you can also find that and other references on my blog posts.
Okay, very good. Well, Mitch, thanks so much. It's been very stimulating, very interesting presentation. I've learned a lot. I don't like most of what I've learned, but I've learned a lot about this, and look forward to reading more and looking in much more detail.